The infant's cry echoed against stone walls, piercing the mountain air like a blade through flesh. In the pale light of dawn, 5 elderly men stood in a circle on the western slope of Mount Tatus, their crimson cloaks snapping in the wind that swept down from the peaks. The child was 5 days old. His mother had bathed him in wine, as tradition demanded, to test his constitution. He had survived. Now came the second test, the one that mattered. The Jerusa, the Council of Elders, held absolute authority over this moment. They were not doctors, they were not priests, they were warriors who had survived 6 decades of Sparta's brutal reality, men whose bodies bore the scars of countless battles, whose hands had killed more enemies than they could count. Their faces showed no emotion as they examined the squirming infant laid naked on the cold stone before them. One elder, a man named Biarcitus, who had fought in the wars against Messenia, lifted the child by his ankles. The baby screamed louder. Procus studied the leg, the angle of the foot, the muscle tone in the tiny calf. He passed the infant to the next elder, who inspected the chest, counting ribs, measuring the width of the shoulders with his weathered fingers. A third elder pried open the baby's mouth, examining the palate, the tongue, searching for any deformity that might impair speech or breathing. The mother stood 30 paces away, held back by 2 Spartan warriors. Her name was Kyra. She was 19 years old, and this was her first child. She could not speak. She could not plead. To do so would bring shame upon her household and doom her son. Regardless of the council's decision, she could only watch as these 5 old men determined whether her child would live or die. Her fingernails cut crescent into her palms. Blood trickled down her wrists unnoticed. The inspection lasted 7 minutes. 7 minutes of methodical examination while the infant's screams grew. Finally, the eldest of the council, a man named Leuctra, who claimed descent from the legendary lawgiver himself, raised his hand. The other elders stepped back in the sudden silence, broken only by the wind and the baby's ragged breathing. Like spoke a single word. The word was not recorded in any text, it was not written down, but every Spartan knew it. Every mother had nightmares about it. It was the word that decided whether a child would be raised as a warrior of Sparta, or whether his small body would be cast into the gorge known as the apothe, the place of rejection, where the mountain would claim him as it had claimed thousands before. This moment, multiplied across generations, across centuries, created the most feared military force in ancient Greece. But at what cost? What happens when an entire society decides that human worth is measured at birth, that imperfection means death, and that the state owns not just your labor, not just your loyalty, but your very children? If you're fascinated by the dark realities behind ancient civilizations, subscribe now and comment below where you're watching from. This isn't Hollywood fiction or patriotic myth. This is documented history preserved in the writings of Plutarch, Xenophon, and archaeological evidence that still haunts the slopes of Mount Tatus. Every detail you're about to hear is grounded in historical sources, from the inspection rituals to the breeding programs that turned Sparta into a eugenic experiment 2,000 years before that word even existed. Now, back to the story, because Kyra's infant was not the first child examined that morning, and he would not be the last. The year was 412 BC, and Sparta's breeding practices had been perfected over 4 centuries. What began as practical military necessity had evolved into something far more calculated, far more systematic, and far more terrifying than simple warrior training. This was industrial human selection, enforced by law, sanctified by religion, and accepted as normal by a society that measured success in survival rates and battlefield victories. The sun rose higher over Mount Tatus. Mori mothers would arrive before noon. Mori infants would be examined, most would pass, some would not, and in the gorge below where eagles circled and shadows never fully lifted, the mountain kept its secrets. To understand how Sparta became a society that killed its own children as state policy, we must first understand the world it inhabited and the fears that shaped it. The Peloponnese Peninsula in the 8th century BC was not a peaceful place. It was a landscape of competing city-states, each fighting for survival, for resources, for dominance. But among all these powers, Sparta faced a unique and terrifying problem, one that would dictate every aspect of its culture for the next 500 years. The problem was numbers. Specifically, the Spartans were vastly outnumbered by the people they had conquered. Around 730 BC, Sparta had invaded and conquered the neighboring region of Messenia. It was a brutal campaign that lasted nearly 20 years, resulting in the subjugation of an entire population. The Messenians, now called Helots, became state-owned slaves. They worked the land, produced the food, and did all the labor that kept Sparta functioning. But here was the terrifying mathematics that Sparta's rulers had to confront every single day. For every one Spartan citizen, there were approximately 7 helots, 7 slaves for every master, 7 potential rebels for every warrior. Imagine living in that reality. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that the people who grew your food, who worked your fields, who lived all around you, outnumbered you 7-1 and had every reason to want you dead. The helots had not volunteered for slavery. They had not been bought in foreign markets. They were Menians who remembered being free, who still spoke their own language, who told their children stories of the time before Sparta came. This fundamental imbalance created a siege mentality that would define Spartan culture. The city was not preparing for external invasion. It was preparing for internal uprising. Every law, every custom, every social practice existed to answer one question: how do we remain the dominant minority when surrounded by hostile slaves who want nothing more than to rise up and slaughter us in our beds? The answer Sparta developed was both simple and horrifying. They would become the most efficient killing force the ancient world had ever seen. Every male citizen would be a full-time professional soldier, trained from childhood, physically perfected, mentally conditioned, capable of crushing rebellions with immediate and overwhelming violence. But to create such warriors required more than just training. It required careful breeding. The Spartan territory itself reflected this military paranoia. The city had no walls, a fact that ancient writers found remarkable. Other Greek cities built massive fortifications. Sparta's walls, as King Aegeus famously said, were its warriors. The city center, visible today in archaeological ruins, contained the usual elements: temples, agora, administrative buildings. But what made Sparta unique was what it did not have. No philosophers' schools like Athens, no theaters, no libraries, no markets filled with imported luxuries. Sparta stripped away everything that did not serve its singular purpose, producing warriors. The social structure was rigid and unforgiving. At the top were the Spartiates, the full citizens, the warrior elite. Below them were the Perioci, free inhabitants who lived in surrounding settlements and worked as craftsmen and merchants. At the bottom, vastly more numerous, were the helots, property of the state bound to the land, worked brutally and periodically called through sanctioned murder campaigns called the kryptia. Daily life for a Spartiate was defined by military discipline from dawn to dusk. Men ate in communal messes called caesa, military dining halls, where they were required to contribute equal portions of food, and where conversation focused on war tactics and training. They did not live with their families. Even married men spent most nights in the barracks. Marriage was for breeding, not companionship. Love was for fellow warriors, bonds forged in training and Combat. Women in Sparta had more freedom than in other Greek cities, but do not mistake this for equality. They had this freedom because the state needed them physically strong to produce strong offspring. Spartan women trained athletically, competed in games, and managed households, while men were constantly away at war or training. Ancient writers, particularly those from Athens, found Spartan women scandalous. They exercised nearly naked, spoke boldly in public, and owned property, but this was not liberation. This was functional breeding, stock management. The state needed healthy mothers to produce healthy warriors, so it gave women just enough freedom to maintain physical fitness. The Spartan education system, the agoge, began at age 7 and lasted until age 30. Boys were taken from their mothers and placed into brutal training companies, where older boys hazed younger ones, where food was deliberately scarce to encourage stealing and cunning, where violence was not just permitted but required. They fought each other, they endured ritual beatings, they killed helots as part of their graduation to manhood. This was not education as we understand it. This was breaking and remaking human beings into weapons, but the agoge only shaped those who survived to age 7. Before that came the breeding phase, the systematic program of human selection that began before birth and continued through the first years of life. This phase was quieter than the agoge, less visible to outsiders, but in many ways more terrifying because it operated on infants who could not fight back, could not train harder, could not prove their worth. Their worth was measured in the shape of their bones, the strength of their cries, and the judgment of old men who held life and death in their weathered hands. Archaeological evidence from the Tedita's Gorge tells part of the story. Modern excavations have uncovered deposits of small bones, infant remains that suggest the practice of exposure was not myth but documented reality. Plutarch, writing 500 years after Sparta's peak, preserved descriptions of the inspection rituals. Xenophon, who lived in Sparta and observed its customs firsthand, described the breeding practices with a mixture of admiration and unease. Even critical sources like Aristotle, who had little love for Sparta, confirmed that the city-state operated a systematic program of infanticide and controlled reproduction. The city's power was undeniable. At its height in the 5th century BC, Sparta fielded an army that terrified all of Greece. When Spartan warriors appeared on the battlefield in their crimson cloaks, moving in perfect formation, singing their battle hymns, enemies often broke and ran before contact. The myth of Spartan invincibility was so strong that Athens, the greatest naval power, sought peace with Sparta whenever possible. The Persian Empire, which had conquered half the known world, treated Sparta with cautious respect. But beneath that power, beneath the disciplined phalanxes and the legendary 300 who died at Thermopylae, lay something most ancient sources glossed over. Before the battles, before the training, before the glory, Sparta was killing its own children by the hundreds, maybe by the thousands, over centuries of systematic selection. The breeding program that created Sparta's warriors began with mothers like Kyra, standing on mountain sides watching strangers judge whether their children deserved to live. The morning inspection continued. After Kyra's son, 2 more infants were presented. Both were approved, their families weeping with relief as the elders pronounced them fit. But the 4th child, a daughter born to a family in the Patana district, failed the inspection. The elders found her left foot turned inward at an unacceptable angle. Her mother's screams as the child was carried toward the gorge echoed across the mountainside. Kyra heard them and felt her stomach turn. That could have been her. That could have been her son. The system worked because everyone participated. There was no appeal, no second opinion, no mercy for special circumstances. The law was absolute. the collective good of Sparta, its military strength. Its survival against the Helot threat demanded perfect warriors. Anything less was a liability the state could not afford. Kyra had prepared for this day since she first felt movement in her womb. She was 19 years old, daughter of a Spariate warrior named Pausanias, who had died fighting the Archives 3 years earlier. Her marriage to Nicetas, 25-year-old member of the Skurates warrior company, had been arranged by the Ephors, Sparta's 5 elected magistrates who governed alongside the 2 kings. The arrangement was purely practical. Nicetas needed a wife to maintain his citizen status. Kyra needed a husband to secure her position and inheritance. They had met twice before the wedding, brief awkward encounters where they sized each other up like farmers evaluating livestock. The wedding itself followed Spartan custom, which meant it resembled an abduction more than a ceremony. Nicetas and his agemates had entered Kyra's family home at night, seized her while female relatives feigned resistance, and carried her away. Her head was shaved. She was dressed in a man's cloak and sandals. The symbolism was clear. She was being transformed from girl to breeding partner, stripped of feminine softness, remade into something harder. That night, in a small, dark room in the military barracks, Nicetas consummated the marriage quickly and without tenderness. He left before dawn. Kyra did not see him again for 2 weeks, but she had conceived. Within 3 months her belly swelled. Within 6 months she could feel the child moving, strong kicks that suggested vigor, that suggested a boy. She prayed to Artemis and to Apollo for a healthy child. She exercised daily, running the track at the gymnasium, lifting stone weights, maintaining the physical conditioning that Spartan law required of pregnant women. She ate carefully, choosing foods believed to strengthen the unborn, avoiding anything that might weaken or deform. Other women in her situation offered advice, much of it contradictory. Some said to avoid certain meats, others insisted on drinking wine mixed with herbs. One elderly woman claimed that staring at beautiful statues during pregnancy would make the child beautiful. Another said that singing war hymns to her belly would make the child brave. Kyra tried everything, desperate to control the uncontrollable, to somehow ensure that the life growing inside her would meet the standards of the Gerousia inspection. The labor began on the 5th day of the month of Amissios in the early spring, when the mountain flowers were just beginning to bloom. It lasted 14 hours. A midwife named Thera attended along with 2 younger women learning the craft. They gave Kyra leather to bite, a stick to grip, but nothing to dull the pain. Spartan women were expected to endure childbirth as warriors endured battle in silence or near silence, proving their strength. When the infant finally emerged, slick with blood and fluid, Kyra's first sound was not relief but a sharp intake of breath, fear. The midwife cleaned the child efficiently, checking first the most obvious things: boy or girl. The sex was male. Good. Males were valued higher. Needed more desperately for the warrior class. 10 fingers, 10 toes, she counted. Quickly all present, the limbs appeared straight, the head seemed normally formed, no obvious deformities. Thera wrapped the infant in clean cloth and placed him on Kyra's chest. For 7 seconds, Kyra allowed herself to hope. Her son was alive, he was breathing, he seemed whole. The tiny face scrunched up and let out a strong, healthy wail, but Thera's expression remained carefully neutral. She had seen hundreds of births. She knew that obvious health meant nothing. The Gerousia had rejected perfectly vigorous infants for minor imperfections, a birthmark in the wrong place, skin tone they found displeasurable, a cry that seemed too high-pitched. The standards were arbitrary and therefore terrifying. The bathing and wine came on the 2nd day. This was another test, though what exactly it tested remained unclear. Some claimed it revealed epilepsy or other hidden weaknesses. Others said it simply hardened the infant, preparing him for a harsh life. Kyra watched as Thera immersed her son in a basin of wine mixed with water. The infant screamed. His tiny fists clenched, his face turning red, but he did not convulse. He did not faint. He emerged angry and squalling, which the aura noted with approval. Strong lungs. Strong reaction, good signs, but not guarantees. For 3 more days, Kyra held her son, nursed him, memorized his features. She traced the tiny creases. His palms, she counted his eyelashes, she watched him sleep, his miniature chest rising and falling, so vulnerable, so dependent, she had not named him. Naming came after the inspection. If he passed, to name him before would be to tempt fate, to claim ownership over a life that belonged to Sparta, not to her. Nicatus visited on the 4th evening. He held the infant awkwardly. This man who had trained his entire life to kill efficiently but had never learned tenderness. He examined his son with the same critical eye the Jerusia would use, looking for flaws, searching for weaknesses. After 3 minutes of silent inspection, he handed the child back to Kyra without comment. She understood. He was protecting himself, refusing to form attachment before the state approved. Sleep that night was impossible. Kyra lay in darkness, listening to her son's breathing, watching the faint outline of his body in the cradle beside her bed. In the morning, they would walk to Mount Titus. She would hand her child to strangers who would judge him according to standards she did not fully understand. And if they found him wanting, if they decided he was not fit for Sparta's purposes, he would be taken from her. And she would never see him again. Other women had told her what happened in the gorge. Some said the children died quickly from the fall. Others claimed they lingered, crying alone in the darkness until exposure or predators ended their suffering. A few whispered that some infants survived the fall, landing on ledges or in brambles, but then died slowly over days. These stories were shared in hushed tones. Never in front of men, never in public. They were the secret knowledge of Spartan mothers, the reality beneath the glory. Dawn came too quickly. Kyra rose, washed, and dressed in her plain wool kitten. She wrapped her son carefully, keeping him warm against the morning chill. Other mothers were already gathering in the street, each holding an infant, each face showing the same controlled terror. They did not speak to each other. What was there to say? The walk to Mount Titus took 2 hours. The path wound upward through scrub brush and rocky terrain. Kyra's legs, strong from years of training, managed the climb without difficulty. But her arms ached from holding her son, or perhaps from the tension that locked every muscle in her body. Behind her walked 3 Spartan warriors, their presence ensuring that no mother would flee, that no woman would try to hide her child if the verdict went against her. At the inspection site, the 5 elders were already waiting. They stood like statues, crimson cloaks barely moving in the wind, faces carved from stone. Kyra was 3rd in line. She watched the first mother step forward, watched the elders examine the infant with methodical efficiency. The inspection lasted perhaps 5 minutes. Then Ligon raised his hand and spoke the word. The mother collapsed in relief. Clutching her approved child, she was led away by a female attendant. The second inspection took longer. The infant, a girl, cried constantly. The elders passed her between them, looking increasingly displeased. Finally, Ligon shook his head. The mother's wail split the morning air, a sound of pure agony that seemed to echo off the mountains themselves. 2 warriors seized her arms, holding her back as a 3rd elder carried the screaming infant toward the edge of the gorge. Kyra forced herself to look away. Infant's cries cut off suddenly, then silence. Then the sound of the mother weeping, horrible, ragged sobs that seemed to tear something loose inside Kyra's chest. Now it was her turn. Warrior gestured. Kyra stepped forward on legs that felt disconnected from her body. She held out her son. Br Sidus took The infant and Kyra's arms felt suddenly, terribly empty. The inspection began. Each elder in turn examined her son, their weathered hands rough against his soft skin. The infant, who had been calm in Kyra's arms, began to cry. The sound grew louder, more distressed. Was that good or bad? Did they want to hear strength in his voice, or did the crying displease them? Brasidos examined the legs, bending each tiny joint, testing the flexibility of ankles and knees. Another elder, whose name Kyra did not know, studied the infant's back, running his fingers along the spine, checking for any curve or deformity. A third opened the baby's mouth, peering inside, though what he expected to find in a 5-day-old infant, Kyra could not imagine. The examination continued. 7 minutes, 8 minutes, 9. Kyra's heart hammered so hard she could hear blood rushing in her ears. Her vision narrowed to a tunnel focused on her son's tiny body, passed between these old men like an object, a tool to be evaluated for utility. Finally, Leuctra took the infant. He held the child at arm's length, studying the face, the proportion of the head, the spacing of the eyes. The infant had stopped crying. He stared back at Lion with dark, unfocused eyes, making small grasping movements with his hands. For a moment that stretched into eternity, the elder's expression revealed nothing. Then he lowered the infant, wrapped him back in his cloth, and turned to face Kyra. Like Curran raised his hand. Time stopped. The wind stopped. Kyra's heart stopped. In the silence before speech, in the space between life and death, she understood the true horror of Sparta. This was not war. War had honor, courage, the chance to fight. This was her child's life measured against abstract standards, judged by men who did not know him, did not know her, who cared only about Sparta's strength. Her son was not a person to them. He was raw material, accepted or rejected based on specifications determined by a society that had decided human worth could be calculated. Leuctra spoke the word. The word was suitable. The infant passed inspection. He would live. He would be returned to Kyra, raised until age 7, then taken for training in the agoge. If he survived that, if he proved himself through the brutal education, if he made it to age 30 without dying in combat or training, he would become a full Spartiate, a citizen warrior of Sparta. That was the best-case outcome. That was what Kyra had just won. She took her son back with shaking hands. The warrior who had held her during inspection released his grip. Kyra stumbled away from the circle, holding her child against her chest, feeling his small heart beating, feeling his breath against her neck. Relief flooded through her, so intense it felt like pain, but mixed with that relief was something else. Horror at what she had just participated in, what she had accepted as normal. Horror at the mother behind her in line, whose turn was coming, whose fate was still uncertain. Horror at the gorge, at the small, broken bodies that lay in its depths. Children who had failed evaluations just like the one her son had passed. She had won this round, but in 7 years Sparta would take her son again, and this time it would keep him. The infant inspection on Mount Teodos was not an isolated tradition or sporadic practice. It was the first checkpoint in a systematic breeding program that Sparta maintained for over 400 years, from roughly 700 BC until the city-state's power collapsed in the late 4th century BC. This was not metaphorical eugenics. This was literal state-mandated selection based on physical characteristics, implemented through law and enforced through social pressure that made resistance virtually impossible. The legal foundation came from the Leuctra, the great law code attributed to Laius, the legendary lawgiver who may or may not have existed as a historical figure. Whether like was real or mythical mattered less than the fact that Spartans believed in his laws and followed them with religious devotion. Plutarch, writing in the 1st century AD, but drawing on earlier sources preserved details of these laws. Among them was the explicit requirement that all newborn infants be presented to the elders for inspection. This was not optional, this was not a recommendation. This was law violation of which brought severe penalties, including loss of citizenship. The inspection criteria, according to Plutarch, focused on the child being well-built and sturdy, but what did this mean in practice? The sources are frustratingly vague, probably because the actual standards were subjective and changed over time. We know the elders examined overall body proportion. We know they checked for obvious deformities, club feet, malformed limbs, cleft palates, anything that might impair function as a warrior. We know they assessed vigor, how strongly the infant moved, how loudly it cried, how it responded to the wine bath. What we also know from multiple sources is that the standards went beyond simple health. Sparta was selecting for specific physical characteristics, attempting to breed a superior warrior class through controlled reproduction. This was eugenics, by another name, implemented 2 millennia before Francis Galton coined the term in 1883. The state had decided it could improve human stock through selective breeding, and it had the power to enforce that decision. Archaeological evidence from the Teodos excavations provides grim confirmation. In 1966, Greek archaeologists exploring the gorge known as Apothe discovered deposits of human remains, many of them infants or very young children. Initial analysis suggested these were victims of exposure, children who had been thrown into the gorge and left to die. Later, studies in the 1990s, using modern forensic techniques, confirmed that many of the infant remains showed no signs of injury beyond the fall itself, suggesting they were alive when discarded. The bones showed evidence of malnutrition and disease, but also many completely healthy specimens, children who died not because they were sick, but because they failed to meet arbitrary standards. But the breeding program extended far beyond infanticide. It reached backward to control who reproduced and under what circumstances. Spartan law regulated marriage, sexual activity, and child rearing with an intrusiveness that would be shocking even by modern standards. The state determined when citizens married based primarily on physical fitness rather than personal choice. Both men and women underwent regular inspections to assess their reproductive worthiness. According to Xenophon, who lived in Sparta for several years and wrote extensively about its customs, the legendary Leuctra instituted laws specifically designed to produce strong children. These laws mandated that both parents be in peak physical condition. Men were forbidden to marry until they completed initial military training and demonstrated martial prowess. Women were required to maintain athletic conditioning throughout their reproductive years. The goal was explicit: to ensure that Spartan children were born from the strongest possible genetic stock. Marriage itself in Sparta was stripped of romantic pretense. It was a breeding arrangement, pure and simple. The wedding ceremony, with its ritualized abduction and cross-dressing, symbolized the erasure of individual desire in favor of state purposes. Once married, couples did not live together. Men continued residing in communal barracks, visiting their wives only for procreation. This separation served multiple purposes. It maintained military discipline, prevented the development of family bonds that might compete with loyalty to the state, and ensured that pregnancy resulted from deliberate effort rather than casual cohabitation. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Sparta's breeding program was the practice of wife sharing, documented by multiple ancient sources and openly defended by Spartan apologists. Plutarch describes this custom with remarkable specificity. If an older man had a young, fertile wife, he was encouraged to introduce her to a younger, more vigorous man for breeding. Purposes: if a man admired another man's wife for her beauty or strength, he could approach the husband and request permission to impregnate her. These arrangements were not considered adultery, they were considered patriotic. Duty, putting the state's need for strong offspring above personal possessive feelings. Xenophon confirms this practice and even praises it, arguing that Sparta avoided the jealousy and conflict over women that plagued other Greek cities. He writes that like made it so that if a man wanted to have children by a woman who was another man's wife, he could persuade her husband to let him, and if a man saw a woman in another man's house who was bearing fine children, he could negotiate with her husband to have children by her. The clinical nature of this description reveals how completely Sparta had reduced human reproduction to livestock management. The numbers tell part of the story. At Sparta's peak in the 5th century BC, there were approximately 8,000 full Spartiate citizen warriors. To maintain this number required constant reproduction as warfare, training, accidents, and exposure. Claimed lives regularly, but the birth rate was carefully controlled. Multiple sources indicate that Sparta suffered from oliganthropia, declining population throughout its history. This seems paradoxical. Why would a society obsessed with producing warriors allow its population to shrink? The answer lies in the brutal mathematics of selective breeding. Not all births resulted in approved children. Not all approved children survived to age 7. Not all boys survived the agoge. By some estimates based on ancient population figures and mortality rates, as many as 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 infants may have been rejected at the initial inspection. This does not count those who died from natural causes before inspection, or those killed during the agoge, or those who died in combat before producing children. The system was designed to produce quality, not quantity, even at the cost of demographic suicide. The helots, by contrast, were allowed to breed freely, even encouraged to do so, since their labor sustained Sparta's economy. This created the darkly ironic situation where the enslaved population grew rapidly while the citizen population contracted. The very program designed to produce superior warriors was slowly strangling Sparta by reducing the number of warriors available. Women's role in this system deserves closer examination. Spartan women were famous throughout Greece for their unusual freedom and physical strength. They exercised publicly, often nearly naked, something that scandalized Athenians who kept their women secluded. They owned property, managed estates, and spoke boldly in public. Ancient sources claimed that Spartan women controlled over 40% of the land in Sparta, a proportion unheard of elsewhere in Greece, but this freedom existed to serve the breeding program. Sparta needed physically fit mothers to produce physically fit children. The state allowed women athletic training and nutritional resources, not out of progressive values, but out of eugenic calculation. Aristotle, no friend of Sparta, criticized this system specifically. He argued that giving women so much power had contributed to Sparta's decline, but even he acknowledged that the system produced strong children. Spartan mothers were expected to embrace the breeding program's logic. The famous stories of Spartan mothers telling sons to return with their shields or on them, meaning victorious or dead, reflect the internalization of state values. Women who wept for fallen sons were criticized. Women who celebrated sons' deaths in battle were praised. But what about women whose infants were rejected at inspection? Ancient sources are nearly silent on this. The grief of mothers who lost children to the gorge was not considered worthy of recording. Their pain did not serve the narrative of Spartan strength. The few glimpses we get are heartbreaking. Plutarch mentions in passing that mothers whose children were rejected were not allowed public mourning. to grieve openly would suggest that the elders had made a mistake, that the rejected child had value. Such women were expected to accept the decision silently and attempt to conceive again. The psychological toll of this must have been devastating. To carry a child for 9 months, to endure labor, to bond with an infant for 5 days, and then to watch it taken away and killed, all while being told this was for the greater good, that your child's death made Sparta stronger. How many women internalized this horror as normal? How many were destroyed by it? The system perpetuated itself through indoctrination. Children who survived inspection and the agoge had been conditioned from birth to accept Sparta's values. They grew up believing that weakness deserved death, that the individual existed only to serve the state, that their own survival proved their superiority. These beliefs were reinforced through constant training, through the example of elders, through the entire social structure that rewarded conformity and punished deviation. Religious justification provided another layer of control. Sparta's founding myths emphasized divine sanction for its practices. The oracle at Delhi supposedly approved like Heros laws. Various gods were invoked to bless the breeding program. The helots were said to be naturally inferior, chosen by fate for servitude. These religious narratives made resistance not just treasonous, but blasphemous. Opposition to the gods themselves, but the breeding program had unintended consequences. By killing children with minor defects, Sparta may have eliminated genetic diversity that would have proven beneficial. By focusing only on physical characteristics, they ignored intelligence, creativity, and other traits that might have allowed adaptation to changing circumstances. By creating a society where all energy flowed toward military training, they stunted development in other areas. Sparta produced no great philosophers, no influential artists, no scientific innovations. Its culture was narrowly focused on war to the exclusion of everything else. Ancient writers noticed this. Aristotle criticized Sparta's system explicitly, arguing that it produced good soldiers but poor citizens, men who knew only how to fight and had no skills for peace. Plato, despite initially admiring Sparta, later criticized its single-minded militarism as unsustainable. These critiques were written after Sparta's power had already begun to decline, but they identified real weaknesses built into the system. The scale of the breeding program is difficult to comprehend from our historical distance. We can estimate numbers. If 8,000 Spartiates maintained a population through controlled breeding, if roughly 20 to 25% of births were rejected, that suggests thousands of infanticides over the 4 centuries. This practice continued, thousands of children thrown into gorges, thousands of mothers forced to surrender their infants, thousands of fathers trained to accept this as normal, an entire society organized around the principle that human life had value only if the state decided it did. This was not ancient barbarity or primitive ignorance. This was a sophisticated, deliberately designed system maintained through law, enforced through social pressure, justified through elaborate philosophical and religious frameworks. It worked in the narrow sense that it produced fearsome warriors. Sparta's military reputation was earned through real victories, but it worked at a cost that ancient sources rarely calculated. The cost in human suffering, in parental grief, in children's lives, in the warping of an entire culture around the machinery of selective breeding. Kyra's son had passed inspection. He had survived the first test, but his life was now owned by Sparta, claimed by the state for its purposes. In 7 years, he would be taken to begin the agoge, and there the breeding program would continue its work, winnowing the survivors until only the strongest, the most obedient, the most perfectly conditioned remained. 7 years passed. Kyra's son, now named Leonidas, after a distant ancestor, grew from infant to child under his mother's care that was deliberately limited by Spartan custom. She nursed him for the first year as was expected, but showed no excessive affection. To cuddle a child was to weaken him, to show tenderness was to prepare him poorly for the hardness ahead. Spartan mothers were instructed to toughen their children, to expose them to cold, to hunger, to minor pains that would condition them for greater suffering later. Leonidas learned to walk, to speak, to run. He played war games with other boys in his age group, mock battles that were already training for real ones. He watched older boys return from the agoge with scars and stories, understanding that this would be his future. He was 7 years old when the efforts came for him. The collection happened on a specific day each year, when all Spartan boys who had reached age 7 were gathered from their families and taken to begin formal training. For Leonidas, the day began like any other. Kyra woke him before dawn, fed him a simple breakfast of barley, porridge, and water. She did not embrace him, she did not tell him she loved him. Such displays were considered shameful, signs of weakness that might infect the boy with softness. Instead, she told him what every Spartan mother told her son on this day: return with your shield or on it. Leonidas understood. He had been prepared. He walked to the assembly point without looking back, joining 30 other boys his age. They were lined up, inspected briefly to ensure they were still healthy and fit, then marched out of the city toward the training grounds in the Eurotas Valley. Parents were not allowed to follow. From this moment, these boys belonged to the state. Their families would see them occasionally at festivals or public events, but the bonds of blood had been severed. Their new family was their age cohort, their training company, their fellow warriors. The agoge was divided into age groups. The youngest boys, 7 to 11, underwent the first stage where they learned basic obedience, physical endurance, and the beginnings of combat training. They were organized into agali herds, a telling word choice that reinforced their status as animals to be shaped. Each agala had approximately 60 boys and was supervised by eponymos, a state-appointed overseer with absolute authority. The eponymos for Leonidas' group was named Alcibiades, a scarred veteran in his late 40s who had survived 3 decades of warfare and regarded children as raw material to be hammered into useful shape. His first lesson, delivered on the boys' first night in the barracks, was simple and brutal. He selected 3 boys at random and ordered them to fight each other while the others watched. There were no rules, no referee, just violence. Encouraged and applauded, the fights ended when one boy could not continue. Alcibiades walked among the bloodied children, explaining that this was their life now. Fighting, pain, victory, or defeat, get used to it. Food was deliberately insufficient. Boys were expected to steal to supplement their rations, training them in resourcefulness and cunning. Those who were caught stealing were not punished for stealing, but for getting caught, for showing poor trade craft. This created a constant state of hunger that drove boys to take risks, to develop sneaking skills, to lie and manipulate. Trust between agemates was discouraged, competition was encouraged. They were being trained not just to fight enemies, but to operate individually in hostile territory. Physical training was relentless. Running, wrestling, weapons practice, all conducted without adequate nutrition or rest. Boys trained barefoot, often shirtless in all weather. Winter in the Peloponnese could be brutal with snow in the mountains and freezing rain in the valleys. Summer brought scorching heat. The boys endured both, building physical resilience through constant exposure. But the agoge was not just physical. It included education in reading, writing, music, and poetry, though all oriented toward military purposes. The boys learned to read military orders, to write brief tactical reports. They learned war songs and battle hymns. They memorized poetry that celebrated Spartan victories and Spartan values. There were no philosophy lessons about justice or truth, only practical knowledge that served the warrior's trade. The most infamous aspect of the agoge was the kryptia, the secret ritual that boys underwent in their late teens. This practice, documented by Plutarch and other sources, involved sending young Spartans into the countryside with orders to kill helots, not helots who had committed crimes, not helots who had rebelled, just helots randomly selected, murdered as part of the boys' training. This served multiple purposes. It blooded young warriors, giving them experience with killing before battle. It terrorized the helot population, reminding them of their powerlessness, and it stripped away any remaining humanity, teaching boys that human life had value only if it belonged to a Spartan. The details of the kryptia are particularly chilling. Boys would hide during the day, concealed in the countryside, observing helot movements. At night they would strike, killing helots with daggers, usually attacking them on roads or in fields. The bodies were often left where they fell, visible warnings to other helots. This was not warfare, this was state-sanctioned murder as education. And according to ancient sources, the practice continued for centuries, integral to Spartan military training. Another boy in Leonidas' age group, a child named Aristomos, did not survive the first year of agoge. He was 8 years old when he died. The official explanation was a training accident, a fall during an exercise, but boys who were there told a different story. Aristomos had been weak, unable to keep pace with the others, a constant target for abuse from both instructors and fellow trainees. One evening, during a particularly brutal hazing ritual, older boys had beaten him severely. He collapsed. He did not get up. The Panomos examined him, determined he was dead, and ordered his body removed. The other boys were told this was what happened to the weak. That night they all trained harder, desperate not to be next. The family was informed their son had died honorably in training. They held a brief funeral, marking his grave with a simple stone. But they showed no public grief. To mourn excessively would suggest that Aristomos had been treated unfairly, that his death was tragic rather than instructive. Spartan culture allowed grief only for warriors who died in battle after proving themselves. A boy who died in training had merely revealed his unfitness, saving Sparta the resources that would have been wasted on him. For the girls, the system operated differently, but toward the same eugenic ends. They did not attend the agoge, but they underwent their own training regimen. Spartan girls exercised publicly, competed in athletic contests, and were judged on their physical prowess. The purpose was explicitly to prepare them for childbearing, to ensure they were strong enough to produce healthy offspring and survive the rigors of pregnancy and labor. One such girl was named Gorggo, 10 years old in 47 BC. She trained with other girls her age at the gymnasium, running, throwing, wrestling, all activities that would have been unthinkable for girls in Athens or other Greek cities. Ancient sources describe Spartan girls exercising nearly naked, their bodies oiled and glistening, while men watched and evaluated their physical development. This was not considered sexual, it was considered practical. The state needed to assess which girls were developing into suitable breeding stock. Gorggo was proud of her strength. She could outrun most boys her age. She won wrestling matches against older opponents. She embodied everything Sparta valued in its women: athletic, competitive, tough, but underlying her pride was an understanding, instilled from earliest childhood, that her body existed for the state's purposes. She would be married young, probably at 14 or 15, to a man she likely did not know. She would be expected to produce children, as many as possible, each one subject to inspection and possible rejection. Her value as a person was measured entirely in her reproductive success. When Gorggo reached 14, she was married to a warrior named Lysander, a man of 23 who had just completed his agoge training and earned full citizenship. The wedding followed the standard pattern: ritualized abduction, cross-dressing, consummation in darkness. But unlike some girls who resisted or wept, Gorggo accepted this as her destiny. She had been conditioned to believe that this was honor, that bearing strong children for Sparta was the highest achievement a woman could claim. Her first pregnancy came within a year. She maintained her physical training throughout, running and exercising until the final weeks. The birth was difficult. The labor lasted nearly 20 hours. The midwives worried she might not survive, but Gorggo endured, biting through a leather strap rather than screaming. When the infant finally emerged, a girl, the midwives cleaned her quickly and began the initial assessment. The child appeared healthy, but in the dim light of the birthing room, the midwife noticed something. The infant's right hand had 6 fingers, not a malformed hand, not a useless deformity, simply an extra digit, fully formed and functional. The midwife showed this to Gorggo, whose face went pale. 6 fingers. Would this be considered an imperfection? Would this doom her daughter? The question was agonizing because the standards were arbitrary. Some infants with minor issues passed inspection. Others with barely visible flaws were rejected. There was no way to predict how the elders would rule. Gorggo had 5 days to wait, 5 days of bonding with her daughter, of memorizing her face, of hoping desperately that the extra finger would not matter. On the inspection day, Gorggo climbed Mount Teuotus with her infant daughter. She stood in line behind other mothers, watching as children were evaluated. One boy, perfectly healthy in every visible way, was rejected because the elders determined his head shape was not ideal. His mother's wails echoed across the mountainside. Another girl passed despite having a visible birthmark across her shoulder. There was no pattern, no logic Gorggo could discern. When her turn came, she presented her daughter to the elders. They examined the infant methodically. They reached the right hand with 6 fingers, Brasidas, still serving on the Jerusalem decades after examining Kira's son, held the infant's hand up to the light. He flexed each finger, all moved correctly. The extra digit was not a flaw in the traditional sense, it was simply additional. The elders conferred in low voices. Gorggo could not hear their words. She watched their faces, trying to read their expressions, seeing nothing. Like Hergen, now in his 80s, made the final decision. He examined the hand again, studied the infant's face, looked at Gorggo, assessing the mother's physical fitness. Then he raised his hand and spoke. The word was reject. The infant failed inspection. The extra finger, functional though it was, marked her as imperfect. She would not be allowed to live. Gorggo did not scream. She had been trained her entire life for this possibility, trained to accept the state's judgment, trained to subordinate her maternal instincts to Spartan logic. But something broke inside her in that moment, something fundamental and irreparable. The warriors held her arms. As an elder carried her daughter toward the gorge, Gorggo watched her face, frozen in an expression that was not quite grief, not quite rage, something colder and more terrible. She watched her daughter disappear into the mountain's shadow. She heard no sound from the gorge. Perhaps the child died quickly, perhaps not. Gorggo would never know. She returned to Sparta in silence. She resumed her training. Within 6 months she was pregnant again, dutifully producing offspring for the state that had killed her daughter. This time she gave birth to a son who passed inspection, then another son, then another daughter who also passed. Over 16 years, she bore 7 children. 3 were rejected at inspection. 4 survived to be raised. Of those four, 2 boys died in the agoge, 1 boy and 1 girl reached adulthood. This was considered a successful reproductive record. Gorggo had fulfilled her purpose. But the breeding program's victims were not only infants. The system consumed adults too, grinding them down in different ways. The practice of wife sharing, praised by Xenophon as enlightened policy, created its own suffering. Women were passed between men. Like breeding mares, their consent was never sought. Their feelings were irrelevant if an older husband decided his young wife should bear children by a younger warrior. She had no choice in the matter. If a warrior wanted access to another man's wife for breeding purposes, social pressure made refusal almost impossible. There was a woman named Allah, wife of a Spariate named Midon, who had reached his 40th year. Without producing sons, the 2 daughters she had borne him, both of whom had passed inspection and survived to adulthood, were considered insufficient. Sparta needed sons, warriors, and Midon's age was making further reproduction with Althea unlikely to produce vigorous offspring. So Medon, following accepted custom, approached a younger warrior named Timicius and arranged for him to impregnate Althea. Althea was not consulted. She was informed of the arrangement one evening by her husband, who explained it as a patriotic necessity. She was 30 years old, still healthy and fertile, still attractive, but her feelings about being sexually shared with another man were not considered relevant. This was her duty. This was normal. Every woman in Sparta understood that her body existed for reproduction, and reproduction served the state's needs, not her own desires. The arrangement was consummated that night. Timicius came to Maiden's house. The husband left. The wife submitted. She became pregnant. She bore a son who passed inspection. Timicius was credited as the biological father. Private records, but publicly the child was Midon's heir. Althea's agency in this transaction was zero. She was a vessel used by the state through the intermediary of male citizens who had the authority to loan her body to others. These stories multiplied across generations. The breeding program touched every family, every marriage, every pregnancy. It created a society where human reproduction was entirely controlled by state interests, where parental bonds were deliberately weakened, where children learned from birth that their worth was conditional, and their lives belonged to Sparta. The psychological damage must have been immense, though ancient sources rarely discuss it. Mental health was not a concept ancient Greeks recognized in modern terms. Depression, trauma, grief, these were considered weaknesses to be suppressed, not conditions requiring care. The cumulative effect was a population selected for physical prowess and obedience, but psychologically damaged, emotionally stunted, incapable of the kinds of relationships and cultural achievements that allowed other Greek cities to flourish. Sparta produced fearsome warriors, but little else. Its contribution to Greek philosophy, art, science, and literature was negligible. The city's entire culture was consumed by its breeding and training programs, leaving no energy for anything beyond warfare. And even the warfare was beginning to fail. By the late 5th century BC, Sparta's population was declining noticeably. The oliganthropia, the shortage of men, became more severe with each generation. Casualties from constant warfare were not being replaced because the breeding program, despite its focus on producing warriors, was actually reducing the population through excessive selectivity. The pool of potential mothers was shrinking because female infanticide removed girls who might have grown into fertile women. The pool of potential fathers was shrinking because the agoge killed boys before they could reproduce. Sparta was breeding itself toward extinction, too focused on quality to recognize the quantity problem until it was too late. The final centuries of Spartan power would see Desperate attempts to address this demographic crisis, attempts that ultimately failed because they could not solve the fundamental contradiction. A society built on systematic human selection will eventually run out of humans to select. The breaking point came not suddenly, but gradually, a slow motion collapse that took more than a century, but whose seeds were planted in the breeding program itself. In 371 BC, 50 years after Cairo watched her son pass inspection, Sparta faced a crisis that would shatter its carefully constructed warrior society and expose the fatal flaws in its eugenic experiment. The crisis began at the Battle of Leuctra, where Spartan forces met the army of thieves on a July morning that would change Greek history. Sparta had dominated Greek military affairs for 2 centuries. Its warriors were considered invincible. When Spartan foes appeared on the battlefield in their crimson cloaks, enemies routinely broke and fled, but at Leuctra something different happened. The Thene general Epaminondas had studied Spartan tactics for years, searching for weaknesses in what seemed like perfect military machine. He found them in the very breeding program that had created Sparta's warriors. The Spartans were predictable because their training was standardized. They were inflexible because their education discouraged creative thinking. They were vulnerable to concentrated attack because their numbers had declined so severely that they could no longer replace losses. Epaminondas developed a new formation, concentrating his best troops on one wing in a massive column that could punch through the Spartan line. It worked. The battle was brief and decisive. In less than 2 hours, 400 Spartiates died, 400 out of a total citizen population that had shrunk to fewer than 1,500. In one afternoon, Sparta lost a quarter of its full citizens, a demographic catastrophe from which it would never recover. But the numbers tell only part of the story. The psychological impact was perhaps even more devastating. Among the dead was a warrior named Leonidas, son of Kyra, now 42 years old, survivor of the agoge and 3 decades of warfare. He died in the front ranks, fighting in the traditional Spartan way, refusing to retreat even as the Theban column crashed through his formation. His body was recovered after the battle, stripped of armor, left in a pile with hundreds of others. The Spartan survivors, retreating in shame, carried what bodies they could back home for burial. Kyra, now in her 60s, received news of her son's death without visible emotion as Spartan mothers were expected to respond. She had fulfilled her duty. She had produced a warrior. He had died in battle. This was the best outcome any Spartan could hope for. But in private, in the darkness of her room, Kyra wept for the first time since she had stood on Mount Tagus, holding her infant son, knowing his life was not her own. She had survived to see that life taken by the system she had accepted, the breeding program that had claimed her son first at 5 days old, then again at 7 years, and finally at 42. The defeat at Leuctra triggered a cascade of consequences. Spartan prestige shattered. Cities that had submitted to Spartan dominance rebelled. Messenia, enslaved for 3.5 centuries, rose up and won its freedom. The Helot population that had sustained Sparta's economy disappeared almost overnight as freed slaves fled or joined the Thene forces, occupying the Peloponnese. Sparta's agricultural system collapsed. The economy collapsed. The carefully balanced machine that had functioned for 400 years suddenly seized and stopped. But deeper than the military or economic crisis was the demographic reality. With only 1,500 full citizens left, and with 400 of those now dead, Sparta could not field the armies it needed. The breeding program's success at producing quality warriors had failed to produce sufficient quantity. The city-state found itself in the absurd position of being surrounded by enemies with no way to defend itself. because its population was simply too small. Desperate measures followed. The heirs passed laws allowing perioi, the free non-citizens, to join the military. They freed some helots and enlisted them as soldiers. They even began relaxing the inspection standards, allowing children who previously would have been rejected to be raised as warriors, but it was too late. The system had been optimized for a specific set of conditions that no longer existed. Changing it now was like trying to reprogram a machine while it was exploding. One of the most telling incidents from this period involves a woman named Penthea, a Spartan mother who gave birth during the crisis years following Leuctra. Her son was born with a club foot, an obvious deformity that under normal circumstances would have guaranteed rejection. But these were not normal circumstances. Sparta needed every warrior it could get. The Gerousia, now desperate, debated whether to relax standards enough to accept children with minor disabilities. Panthea stood before the elders with her son, arguing that a warrior with a club foot could still throw a spear, still hold a shield wall position, still fight and die for Sparta. The historical irony was bitter. For centuries, Sparta had killed children for far less than a clubfoot, pursuing an ideal of physical perfection. Now faced with extinction, it was considering whether survival mattered more than purity. The elders, including some who had participated in hundreds of inspections and rejected hundreds of infants, debated for hours. They ultimately rejected Panthea's son. Even in crisis, even facing demographic collapse, they could not bring themselves to abandon the standards. The breeding program had become so fundamental to Spartan identity that changing it felt like betraying everything the city stood for. Better to maintain purity and die out than to accept imperfection and survive. This decision, repeated across dozens of cases in the years following Leuctra, sealed Sparta's fate. The psychological toll was enormous. Warriors who had survived the agoge, who had killed helots in the kryptia, who had fought in multiple campaigns, now faced an existential question. What had it all been for? They had sacrificed their childhoods to brutal training. They had watched age-mates die in training and in battle. They had participated in infanticide and systematic murder. And for what? For a system that was collapsing anyway, that had been unsustainable from the beginning, that had been slowly killing Sparta through its own success. Some warriors broke. There are accounts from this period of Spartiates refusing orders, fleeing battle, even openly criticizing the system that had created them. These acts were unthinkable in earlier generations. A Spartiate who showed cowardice was subjected to public humiliation, marked with special clothing, excluded from the common messes, essentially made a non-person. But now, with the system crumbling, these punishments lost their power. What was the point of maintaining discipline when discipline had led to destruction? The breeding program did not end abruptly. It continued in diminished form for another century, but its justification was gone. The helots had been freed, so the rationale of maintaining demographic superiority over an enslaved population no longer applied. Sparta's military reputation was shattered, so the promise of creating invincible warriors rang hollow. The population kept shrinking despite the breeding program, proving it had never worked as intended. Yet the rituals continued. The inspections on Mount Titis, the rejection of infants, the agoge training, all carried on through momentum and tradition even after their purpose had evaporated. In 331 BC, 60 years after Leuctra, a Spartiate named Agus IV attempted reforms. He proposed redistributing land, expanding citizenship to perioc, and most radically ending the infant inspections and allowing all Spartan children to live. The proposal was revolutionary, attacking the core of Spartan identity. The Gerousia and the ephors rejected it violently. Aegis was eventually executed for his reform attempts, murdered by the system he had tried to save by changing. His death marked a turning point. It demonstrated that Sparta would rather die as it was than survive as something different. The breeding program was not just policy, it was identity to abandon. It was to admit that 400 years of infanticide, of brutal training, of systematic abuse had been wrong. That admission was psychologically impossible. For a society that had built its entire self-image on the rightness of those practices, the archaeological record from this period shows the human cost. Excavations in the Tigris Gorge have revealed layers of deposits with infant remains datable to different periods based on associated artifacts. Deposits continue through the late 4th and early 3rd centuries BC, proof that the infanticide continued even as Sparta's population collapsed. Parents were still bringing infants to the mountain, elders were still conducting inspections, children were still being thrown into the gorge. The machine kept running even as it ground Sparta to dust. Individual stories from this period are fragmentary but heartbreaking. A grave marker from 300 BC commemorates a boy named Presidius, who died in a gorge training at age 10. The inscription, unusually personal for Spartan memorials, suggests the family's grief broke through cultural expectations. Another marker memorializes a girl who died at age 12 before she could fulfill her reproductive duty, described as taken before her time. These small cracks in the Stoic facade reveal the human anguish that had been suppressed for centuries. The final blow came not from internal reform, but from external conquest. In 222 BC, Macedonian forces under antagonist Docent defeated Sparta at the Battle of Silesia. The remaining Spartiates, fewer than 700 full citizens, were crushed. Sparta was occupied. The agoge was disbanded. The breeding program finally ended, not through enlightened reform, but through military defeat and occupation by a foreign power. What remained was ruins and memory. The physical structures of Sparta, never impressive compared to Athens or other Greek cities, decayed rapidly, but the memory of Sparta, the myth of its warriors, persisted. That memory was carefully curated, emphasizing the glory and discipline while downplaying or ignoring the systematic child murder, the eugenic breeding, the psychological damage. The myth of Sparta became more influential than the reality had ever been, inspiring militaristic societies for 2 millennia afterward. But for those who lived through Sparta's actual system, for the mothers who lost children to inspection, for the boys who suffered through the agoge, for the girls raised as breeding stock, for the men who died fighting for a society that had never valued them as individuals, the reality was very different from the myth. The reality was a 400-year-long experiment in treating humans as livestock, in valuing strength over humanity, in pursuing an ideal of perfection at the cost of everything that makes life worth living. Kyra died in 367 BC, 4 years after her son fell at Lra. She was 67 years old, having outlived the son she had born and defended before the Jerusalem. She was buried in a simple grave with no marker, as was Spartan custom for women. Her life, like those of countless other Spartan women, was considered unremarkable. She had performed her duty, she had produced a warrior, nothing more needed to be said. But her story, multiplied by thousands, tells the real history of Sparta's breeding program, not the glory of disciplined warriors holding the pass at Thermopylae, not the myth of fearless mothers telling sons to return with their shields or on them. The real history is simpler and darker, a society that decided human worth could be measured and found thousands wanting, a population that participated in its own genetic experiment and reaped the consequences, a culture that chose death and decline over admitting its foundational beliefs were wrong. In the decades following Sparta's collapse as a military power, the city-state lingered as a shadow of its former self, still clinging to traditions that had lost all practical purpose. The breeding program, though officially ended by Macedonian occupation, left consequences that rippled through generations. The survivors, both those who had benefited from the system and those who had been damaged by it, had to reckon with what had been done in the name of strength and excellence. The most immediate consequence was demographic. By 200 BC, the Spartiate population had shrunk to fewer than 700 full citizens from a peak of around 804 centuries earlier. This collapse was not due to warfare alone, though wars had claimed many lives. The breeding program itself had engineered this decline through its relentless selectivity. Every rejected infant represented not just one death, but the eraser of an entire potential lineage. Child killed at 5 days old never grew up to have children of their own. Their children would never have children. Each act of infanticide cascaded forward through generations, pruning the population tree more severely with each passing decade. The economic consequences were equally severe. Sparta's agricultural system had depended on Helot labor. When Messenia gained independence and the Helots fled or were freed, Sparta lost not just workers, but the entire economic foundation that had supported its warrior class. Spartiates had never learned to farm or practice trades. They were professional soldiers who depended on others to produce their food and goods. When those others left, Sparta faced starvation. The city-state that had prided itself on self-sufficiency and discipline became dependent on aid from other Greek cities. Some Spartans adapted. There are records of former Spartiates working as mercenaries, hiring out their combat skills to whoever would pay. Others became guards or trainers for wealthy families in other cities, but for men who had been raised to believe they were superior to all other Greeks who had been conditioned to view manual labor as beneath them. This descent into working for pay was psychologically devastating. Their entire identity had been constructed around being Spartan warriors. When that identity collapsed, they had nothing left. The women faced different challenges. Spartan women had owned substantial property, up to 40% of the land according to ancient sources, but with the agricultural system collapsed and the population shrunken, land ownership meant little. Former Spartan women found themselves relatively wealthy in land, but poor in resources to work that land or defend it. Some married outside Sparta, their unusual independence and physical strength making them attractive despite their city's decline. Others remained in Sparta, managing declining estates, watching the city decay around them. For those who had been victimized by the breeding program, there was no justice, no acknowledgement, no reckoning. The mothers who had lost infants to inspection received no apology. The children who died in the agoge received no memorials. The women who had been sexually shared as breeding stock received no recognition that what had happened to them was abuse. Sparta's culture of stoicism, of suppressing emotion and embracing harsh reality, prevented any public processing of the trauma the system had inflicted. But privately, in ways that rarely made it into historical records, some survivors spoke. A few inscriptions from this period show unusual sentiments. 1. Grave marker from the late 3rd century BC commemorates a child described as taken too soon by cruel judgment, a phrase that suggests the family did not accept the inspection system's legitimacy. Another memorial honors a woman who bore the unbearable, which might refer to losing children to infanticide. These small textual fragments hint at private grief that Spartan culture had forbidden public expression. Archaeological evidence provides another window into the Aftermath. Excavations of Spartan homes from this period show sudden changes in material. Culture, items that were forbidden or discouraged under the strict Spartan system, imported pottery, jewelry. Decorative objects appear in increasing quantities. This suggests that as the system collapsed, survivors began reclaiming individual preferences and possessions that had been suppressed. The uniform austerity that had characterized Spartan life gave way to diversity and even luxury, signs that people were rejecting the values that had dominated for centuries. The fate of specific individuals from earlier stories can be traced in some cases. Gorggo, the woman who lost her daughter for having 6 fingers, lived to see the system that had killed her child collapse. There are no records of her reaction. Did she feel vindicated? Did she mourn all over again, realizing her daughter could have lived if she had been born a generation later? Did she rage at the waste of it all? We do not know. Spartan culture's prohibition. Emotional expression means we have almost no first-hand accounts of how survivors felt about the breeding program's end. Some younger Spartans who grew up during the transition period wrote about their experiences. A man named Aristomenes, born around 300 BC, wrote a memoir that has survived in fragments. In it, he describes the confusion of growing up in a society where the old rules were breaking down, but new ones had not yet formed. His generation was the first in 400 years. Not subjected to infant inspection, not taken at age 7 for the agoge, not trained as professional warriors from childhood. He describes feeling adrift, lacking the sense of purpose and identity that had sustained earlier generations. Even though that purpose had been destructive, this identity crisis affected not just individuals but the entire culture. Sparta had defined itself entirely through its breeding and training systems. When those systems ended, what was Sparta? The question had no good answer. Some tried to revive the old ways, proposing returns to traditional practices, but these attempts failed because the material conditions that had enabled the breeding program no longer existed. You cannot have a warrior elite supported by enslaved agricultural workers when there are no longer any slaves. You cannot select only the strongest children when your population is already too small to sustain itself. The broader Greek world watched Sparta's decline with mixed feelings. Some cities that had suffered under Spartan domination celebrated. Others felt genuine sadness at seeing a once great power reduced to poverty and irrelevance. Many Greek writers attempted to explain what had gone wrong. Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BC, argued that Sparta's excessive focus on military excellence had made it unable to adapt to changing circumstances. Aristotle had made similar points earlier, critiquing Sparta's narrow education and its treatment of women, but few ancient writers explicitly connected Sparta's decline to its breeding program, the infanticide, the eugenics, the systematic child murder. These were either ignored or mentioned briefly without moral judgment. Ancient Greek culture generally accepted infant exposure as normal, though Sparta practiced it more systematically than other cities. The ancient critique of Sparta focused on its militarism, its treatment of helots, and its economic system, but rarely questioned the fundamental assumption that the state could decide which children deserve to live. This silence in ancient sources has shaped modern understanding. For centuries, historians and philosophers who admired Sparta's discipline and military prowess glossed over or justified the breeding program. They emphasized the warrior culture, the physical training, the battlefield successes, while treating the infanticide as an unfortunate necessity or ignoring it entirely. Only in recent decades have scholars begun seriously examining the breeding program as a system of state-sanctioned child murder. and recognizing its centrality to Spartan culture, modern archaeological work has been crucial in correcting the record. The excavations at Titus, though still incomplete due to the difficulty of accessing the gorge, have provided physical evidence that ancient literary sources minimized the remains of hundreds of infants and young children found in the deposits cannot be explained away or minimized. They are material proof of systematic infanticide on a scale that ancient writers preferred not to emphasize. DNA analysis of some of these remains conducted in recent years has revealed additional insights. Many of the infants show no genetic markers for serious diseases or conditions. They were not killed because they were sick or doomed to suffer. They were killed because they failed to meet arbitrary standards of physical appearance. Some had minor skeletal variations that would have caused no impairment. Others showed no detectable abnormalities at all, suggesting they might have been rejected for soft tissue features that do not preserve facial features the elders found displeasing, skin conditions, or simply bad luck in the timing of their inspection. Program's legacy extended far beyond Sparta itself. The city-state's reputation as a warrior culture influenced later societies, often in dangerous ways. Nazi Germany explicitly cited Sparta as a model for its own eugenic programs, pointing to the infant inspections as precedent for eliminating inferior genetic stock. This connection is historically questionable. Sparta's program was not based on modern genetic theory and had different objectives, but it demonstrates how the myth of Sparta could be twisted to justify 20th century atrocities. Less obviously, but perhaps more pervasively, Sparta contributed to a broader cultural acceptance of the idea that human worth can be measured, that some lives are more valuable than others, that the collective good can justify individual suffering. These ideas, present in many cultures, but particularly prominent in Sparta, have justified countless abuses throughout history. The breeding program was an early systematic implementation of principles that would reappear in eugenics movements, racial theories, and ideologies that ranked human beings by criteria determined by whoever held power. In modern Sparta, the Greek city of Sparta, built near the ancient ruins, there is little acknowledgement of the breeding program. Tourist sites emphasize the military glory, the famous battles, the discipline and courage of Spartan warriors. The Tegetus Gorge is rarely mentioned. The infanticide is not displayed in museums. The statues honor warriors, not the children they killed or the mothers who lost them. This selective memory perpetuates the myth while burying the reality, but the reality remains, preserved in ruins and bones, in fragmentary texts and archaeological deposits. Sparta's breeding program was not an unfortunate side effect of militarism. It was central to the system, the foundation on which everything else was built. Understanding Sparta requires confronting this reality rather than romanticizing or minimizing it. The city-state that produced history's most feared warriors did so by systematically murdering children and psychologically damaging everyone who survived. The final official act related to the breeding program came in 146 BC, when Rome conquered Greece and Sparta became part of the Roman Empire. Roman authorities governing through local elites formally prohibited the remaining practices of the agoge and the infant inspections. By that point, these practices had already largely ceased, but the Roman prohibition ensured they would not be revived. The Tegetus Gorge finally fell silent. No more infants would be carried up the mountain. No more mothers would wait in terror for elders' judgment. The 400-year experiment in human selective breeding was officially over. What remained was memory, contested and controversial. To some, Sparta represented discipline and excellence. To others, it represented the dangers of valuing collective strength over individual humanity. Both views contained truth. Sparta had been militarily successful for centuries, proving that its system produced effective warriors. But that success came at a cost measured in thousands of small bodies in a mountain gorge, in countless traumatized survivors, in a culture that had stripped away humanity in pursuit of an impossible ideal. Today, if you visit the ruins of ancient Sparta, you will find remarkably little. Unlike Athens with its Parthenon or Delhi with its temples, Sparta left few impressive structures. The city that dominated Greece for centuries has almost disappeared, leaving behind foundations, scattered pottery, and the ghosts of its brutal past. But if you travel west from the modern city of Sparta into the foothills of Mount Tatus, and if you are willing to hike difficult trails into the mountain's western faces, you can still find the gorge. The apothe, the place of rejection, remains. It is a deep cleft in the limestone, shadowed most of the day, difficult to access. Eagle's Circle. Above it, in spring, wild flowers grow along its edges, nature reclaiming a place once dedicated to death. The gorge keeps its secrets. Not all of it has been excavated. Not all remains have been recovered. Somewhere in that darkness lie the bones of thousands of Spartan children whose only crime was failing to meet standards determined by old men measuring them against an abstract ideal. The legacy of Sparta's breeding program extends far beyond one ruined city or one mountain gorge. It raises questions that remain relevant today, questions about how societies decide who has value, about who gets to make those decisions, about what happens when efficiency and strength are prioritized over mercy and individual worth. These are not ancient questions. They are contemporary, urgent, appearing in different forms, but with the same fundamental dynamics. Modern debates about genetic screening, prenatal testing, and reproductive technology echo Sparta's concerns, though with different tools and contexts. We can now detect genetic conditions before birth. We can screen embryos for diseases. We can, in theory, select for certain traits. Some see this as progress, the ability to prevent suffering by avoiding births that would result in serious impairment. Others see the shadow of Sparta, the danger of defining some lives as not worth living, of making judgments about human worth based on predicted characteristics. The distinction between preventing genuine suffering and imposing arbitrary standards for perfection is not always clear. Sparta claimed to be preventing suffering too, arguing that weak children would suffer more if allowed to live in a harsh world that demanded strength. Modern advocates of genetic screening make similar arguments about preventing diseases that cause pain and limited life expectancy. But where is the line? Who draws it? What prevents the gradual expansion of acceptable reasons to reject a potential life, the slow slide from eliminating serious disease to selecting for preferred traits? Sparta's example provides a warning. The city-state began probably with pragmatic concerns about infant mortality and the need for healthy warriors, but the program expanded over time, became more rigid, developed into a system of arbitrary aesthetic judgments that had nothing to do with actual health or capacity. The extra finger on Gorggo's daughter was fully functional, caused no impairment, yet was grounds for death. The club foot that might have made running difficult but would not have prevented a sedentary life was unacceptable. The standards became about perfection, not about capacity, about meeting an ideal rather than avoiding genuine suffering. This pattern, pragmatic concerns evolving into systematic discrimination, appears throughout history. Sparta is simply one clear example preserved in historical record and archaeological evidence. The program's trajectory from practical necessity to ideological rigidity offers Lessons about how such systems develop and why they are difficult to reform. Once a society has invested centuries in a particular approach, once that approach has become identity rather than policy, changing it requires admitting that previous generations were wrong, that the suffering inflicted was meaningless. That admission is psychologically nearly impossible, as Sparta demonstrated by choosing extinction over reform. The breeding program also illuminates the role of cultural pressure in sustaining systems that most participants might privately question. How many Spartan mothers truly believed their infants deserve to die for minor imperfections? How many fathers privately questioned whether the agoge's brutality was necessary? How many elders on the Gerutia felt doubt when ordering an otherwise healthy child to be thrown into the gorge? We cannot know for certain, but the psychological research on conformity and authority suggests that many participants in harmful systems have private doubts they never express publicly. Sparta's culture of stoicism, its prohibition on displaying emotion or questioning collective decisions, created conditions where private doubt could not become public dissent. Everyone participated in the system while assuming everyone else fully believed in it, creating a collective illusion that the system had unanimous support when it might have been sustained largely through individual fear of breaking from the group. This dynamic appears in many contexts: totalitarian regimes, cults, abusive institutions, anywhere that conformity is enforced and dissent punished. The gender dynamics of Sparta's breeding program deserve particular attention. Women bore children whose fates they could not control. They were expected to produce offspring on demand, to submit to state-mandated breeding arrangements, including wife sharing, and to show no grief when their children were rejected or killed. The supposed freedom and status of Spartan women, emphasized by ancient sources, was entirely functional. They were given just enough autonomy to maintain physical fitness for reproduction, but no autonomy over their reproductive lives themselves. This pattern of granting women conditional functional freedom while denying them actual agency appears in various historical contexts. Societies that need women's labor or reproductive capacity may provide education, property rights, or public roles while still fundamentally treating women as resources rather than autonomous individuals. Sparta's example makes this dynamic visible in stark terms, but the underlying principle operates more subtly in many cultures. Perhaps the most disturbing legacy of Sparta is how easily the reality has been romanticized and mythologized. For 2,000 years, writers and thinkers have praised Spartan discipline, held up Spartan warriors as ideals, and either ignored or justified the breeding program. This selective memory serves ideological purposes. Those who want to emphasize strength and military prowess point to Sparta. Those who want to critique individualism and promote collective identity point to Sparta. But these uses of Sparta almost always involve ignoring or minimizing the systematic child murder that was absolutely central to the system. The myth of Sparta has proven remarkably durable and adaptable. Modern films and popular culture often present Spartans as heroic warriors fighting for freedom, which is historically absurd given that Sparta maintained power through enslaving the Messenian population. The 300 warriors at Thermopylae are celebrated, while the thousands of infants in the Tatus Gorge are forgotten. This selective memory is not accidental. It serves the purpose of maintaining an inspiring myth while discarding the inconvenient reality that inspiration came at horrific cost. Modern Sparta, the Greek city near the ancient site, has a complicated relationship with this legacy. Tourism is economically important, and tourists come to see Spartan sites because of the warrior myth. local museums, and cultural centers must balance historical accuracy with the expectations of visitors who want to see glory and discipline, not infanticide and abuse. Some sites have begun incorporating more honest presentations of Spartan practices, including the breeding program, but this remains controversial, with some arguing that focusing on negatives denigrates Spartan ancestors, while others insist that honesty about the past is essential to learning from it. The question of what we should learn from Sparta remains open. Some lessons seem clear: treating humans as means to collective ends, rather than as ends in themselves, leads to horror. Systematic programs to improve human populations through selective breeding have failed throughout history, often dramatically. So, militaristic societies that devote all resources to warfare tend to be brittle and unable to adapt to changing circumstances. Strength without compassion is not virtue but cruelty. But other questions are harder. How do we balance individual autonomy with collective needs? When is it appropriate for society to make decisions about reproduction, if ever? How do we prevent the kind of groupthink that allowed thousands of Spartans to participate in infanticide while apparently believing it was not just acceptable, but noble? How do we recognize when our own societies might be engaging in practices that future generations will judge as harshly as we now judge Sparta? These questions have no easy answers, but Sparta's example suggests that humility is essential. Any system that claims to have perfected humanity, that insists its standards are objective and absolute, that demands conformity and punishes dissent, should be viewed with deep skepticism. Sparta was absolutely convinced of the rightness of its breeding program for 400 years. That certainty did not make the program right. It made it more dangerous, because people who believe they are pursuing perfection will justify any means. The infant bones in the Titus Gorge do not speak. The mothers who climbed that mountain in terror left no writings. The boys who died in the agoge wrote no memoirs. History has silenced the victims while preserving the words of the powerful. The philosophers who debated Spartan practices, the historians who recorded Spartan victories. But archaeology gives the victims a voice through physical evidence. The bones tell us what the texts often omit: that real children died, that real suffering occurred, that the cost of Sparta's glory was measured in small bodies broken against stone. If this story disturbs you, if it makes you question how societies decide who has value and who does not, then it has served its purpose. Subscribe to this channel if you believe historical truth matters more than comfortable myths. If you think we should study the past honestly rather than selectively. If you want to understand how systems of abuse develop and persist so we might recognize and resist them in our own time. Share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from? How does your own culture deal with questions of human worth and collective versus individual needs? The Titus Gorge remains. The ancient ruins of Sparta fade further with each passing year, but the questions raised by Sparta's breeding program endure as relevant today as they were 2,400 years ago. We may not expose infants on mountain sides anymore, but we still struggle with how to value human life, how to balance individual rights with collective needs, how to prevent the powerful from deciding that some people matter and others do not. Sparta's example cannot give us answers to these questions, but it can remind us of the stakes when societies decide that human worth is conditional, when they implement systematic programs to select for preferred traits and eliminate undesired ones. The results are measured in bones and grief and cultures that eventually consume themselves. Until next time, remember that the price of any system is paid by those who have no choice in it. The children in the gorge did not choose Sparta's breeding program, they were its victims, and perhaps the most important lesson from their sacrifice is this: no amount of military glory, no degree of discipline and strength, no perfection of the warrior ideal was worth what was done to them. Some costs are simply too high, some methods too cruel, some systems too fundamentally wrong to be justified by any outcome. Sparta learned this lesson too late. We should learn it now while there is still time. The wind still blows across Mount Titus. Eagles still circle above the gorge, and somewhere in that darkness beneath centuries of erosion and vegetation, the evidence remains of what happens when a society values perfection over compassion, strength over mercy, and the state over the individual. The stones remember what humans prefer to forget. May we have the courage to listen.